When the tourists learned the dog they had been tormenting was not just any street animal, but the beloved companion of someone with a powerful history, a retired Army general. The moment that followed would change everything. This story isn't just about a dog or a group of thoughtless tourists. It's about loyalty, respect, and the hidden connections that tie us all together. Stay tuned as we take you through this incredible tale that will leave you questioning what it means to judge others based on appearances. Watch till the end, as what happens next will shock you and make you reflect deeply on how we treat those around us. The stray dog in question wasn't always a wanderer. It hadn't always roamed the streets looking for food scraps and shelter under the shade of nearby trees. In fact, there was a time when this dog had a home, a real home, with a loving owner, someone who had cared for it deeply. This dog's life story wasn't the typical tale of a street animal, drifting from place to place, uncared for and lost. No, this dog had lived a life full of companionship, trust, and loyalty, and it had once been part of something much larger than just a pet. It had been the companion of a retired Army general, someone who had served his country with pride and commitment. The general, now in the later stages of his life, had spent decades in the military, dedicating his life to defending his country and fighting for the freedom of others. For many years, his job had kept him away from family and friends, often sending him into the most dangerous and remote corners of the world. Yet, through all the hardship and separation, the general found solace in one constant companion: his dog. This wasn't just any dog either. This dog had been adopted by the general years earlier during one of his tours, when he was stationed overseas. The dog had been a stray at the time, just another lost and forgotten animal wandering the streets of a foreign city. But there was something about this dog that caught the general's attention. The dog had eyes that spoke of a resilience and a kind of quiet strength, a sense of survival that mirrored the general's own. The general had adopted it on a whim, but it quickly became more than just a pet. It was a confidant in moments of solitude, a source of comfort after long and difficult days. The dog accompanied the general on many missions and long, sleepless nights. During those endless hours of waiting, the dog would curl up beside him, offering a silent form of companionship that didn't need words. There were times when the general felt utterly alone in the world, times when the weight of his responsibilities seemed too much to bear. But in those moments, the dog was always there, offering its silent support. As the years passed, the general began to form an unbreakable bond with the dog. It wasn't just about the companionship anymore. It was about something deeper. The dog became a symbol of everything the general stood for: loyalty, perseverance, and unconditional love. These were qualities the general had admired throughout his own career, and he saw them in the dog every day. No matter where they were, no matter what challenges they faced, the dog was always there for him, and in turn, the general took care of it as best as he could. But as time marched on, both the general and his dog began to feel the effects of age. The general, now retired from active duty, had moved to a small house by the beach. It was a peaceful, quiet place where he could finally put his feet up and reflect on his long and illustrious career. His service to the military was over, but the lessons he had learned, the experiences he had gained, and the sacrifices he had made would stay with him forever. And just as he had done throughout his life, the general continued to care for his dog with the same dedication and devotion that had been a hallmark of his military service. The dog, in return, continued to provide the general with the same unwavering loyalty. Life in the small beach house was simple but fulfilling. The general would wake up early in the morning, take his dog for a walk along the shore, and spend the rest of the day in the company of his loyal companion. There were no longer any battles to fight, no more missions to undertake. But the general still felt the need for purpose, the desire to have someone by his side who truly understood the quiet strength of those who had served. His dog was always there, a steadfast reminder that there was still love and loyalty to be shared in the world, even after years of service and sacrifice. Despite the comfort that the general found in his retirement, his health was beginning to deteriorate. His body, which had once been strong and capable, was starting to show the signs of the many years of physical and mental strain that had come with serving in the military. He could no longer take long walks with his dog or run along the beach as he had in the past. His once vibrant energy had been replaced by fatigue and pain, and the future seemed uncertain. Yet no matter how bad he felt, his dog remained by his side, always ready to offer a comforting presence. As the general's health declined, the bond between him and his dog only grew stronger. The dog could sense that something was wrong, and it stayed even closer to the general, offering silent support and companionship. It would lie next to him on the couch while the general rested, its head gently resting on his lap as if to say, "I'm here. You are not alone." The two of them were like old soldiers, veterans of life's battles, facing the final chapter together. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a deep connection that neither of them needed to articulate. The general knew that the dog had given him its heart, just as he had given the dog his. But time, as it always does, had its own plans. The general's health worsened and the visits to the doctor became more frequent. Eventually, the general had to make the difficult decision to move into a care facility where he could receive the medical attention he needed. He could no longer care for his dog the way he had once done. The dog, loyal as ever, stayed close to the house, waiting for the general's return. But the general's absence was more than the dog could understand. It wandered the streets, searching for its owner, looking for familiar smells, hoping to find the place where they had once shared so many happy days together. And so, the dog became a stray. It didn't understand why the general had disappeared or why it was now alone. All it knew was that it had spent years with the man who had cared for it, and now it was left to fend for itself. Each day the dog would return to the house, pacing the yard, sniffing the air, and waiting for the familiar sound of the general's voice. But there was nothing, only the echoes of the past. The locals who lived in the area began to notice the dog, and some of them would stop to offer it food or water. But the dog wasn't interested in their kindness. It wasn't looking for a new owner or a new family. It was still searching for its old one. It still hoped that one day the general would return and they could pick up where they left off. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the dog's hopes began to fade. It had no way of knowing that the general would never come back in the same way. Though the general's house remained, it was empty now, the windows dark and the door closed. It was a symbol of the life that had once been, and the dog could feel that life slipping away with each passing day. It didn't understand the concept of time in the way that humans did. To it, every day was the same. Another day spent searching, hoping, and waiting. But despite its loneliness, the dog never strayed too far from the house. It knew this place, this small corner of the world, had once been its home, and so it kept returning, day after day, waiting for the general, even though the dog had no way of knowing whether the general was ever coming back. The bond they had shared was powerful, and it couldn't be easily forgotten. For the dog, there was no question of leaving or finding another owner. It simply stayed, steadfast, loyal, and true. The dog's life had changed drastically from the days when it had walked proudly beside the general. But through it all, it had maintained its sense of loyalty. It had never once stopped waiting for its owner to return. In the dog's mind, the general was still out there, somewhere, and one day it would be reunited with the man who had given it a home, a purpose, and a family. The bond they shared was stronger than any hardship the dog would face. The loyalty that had been built over years of service and companionship would never fade, no matter how much time had passed. And so the dog continued to wait, unaware that its life was about to take a turn that would lead to a revelation no one could have predicted. A moment that would change everything, not just for the dog, but for everyone involved in this incredible story. On a sunny afternoon, with the sea breeze blowing gently across the coast, a group of tourists strolled through the bustling streets of the small town. They were excited to explore a new destination, eager to take in the sights and sounds of the place. The streets were lively, filled with the chatter of visitors and the laughter of children running alongside their parents. The warm sun cast a golden glow on the landscape, and the smell of fresh seafood from nearby restaurants filled the air. For these tourists, it was the perfect escape, a chance to experience something new and exciting. But in the midst of this idyllic atmosphere, something unsettling was about to unfold. As the group wandered down the cobblestone streets, they noticed a stray dog lingering nearby. The dog appeared scruffy, its coat a bit matted, its eyes tired from wandering the streets alone for what seemed like an eternity. It wasn't the first time the tourists had seen a stray animal on their travels. They had passed similar sights in many cities before. Stray dogs, they thought, were just part of the landscape in some parts of the world. They were unfortunate, but there wasn't much anyone could do about it. Most of the time they kept their distance, taking pictures of the exotic animals, but not giving them much thought beyond that. This dog, however, caught their attention. There was something about it, something that set it apart from the other strays they had seen. Perhaps it was the way it moved, with a kind of measured grace that suggested it had once known a life of more than mere survival. Or perhaps it was the quiet dignity in its eyes, a look that spoke of untold stories. Yet, to the group of tourists, these observations were not the first things that came to mind. Instead, they simply saw another stray dog, and as they approached, one of the tourists decided it would be funny to engage with the animal in a way that seemed harmless at first, but quickly escalated into something much more troubling. It started with a few half-hearted attempts to provoke the dog. The young man, an eager participant in the group's adventure, picked up a small rock from the street and tossed it near the dog. The rock didn't hit the animal, but the dog flinched and darted away. For a moment the tourist laughed, thinking it was amusing to see the dog so easily startled. The dog, clearly frightened, looked around as if trying to understand the source of this sudden aggression. But the tourists, now emboldened by the animal's reaction, didn't stop. Instead, they thought it would be fun to continue throwing more rocks, harmlessly, they thought, to see how the dog would react. As the rocks began to fly, some of the other members of the group joined in, their laughter growing louder. The dog began to retreat, trying to escape the barrage of small stones, but it had nowhere to go. With each throw, the dog grew more distressed, running in circles, trying to avoid the pain of being struck. Its movements became erratic, and its body language revealed just how terrified it was. The tourists, caught up in their moment of amusement, didn't seem to notice the fear they were causing. They were too absorbed in their own entertainment, too far removed from the reality of what was happening to fully understand the cruelty of their actions. In the midst of the chaos, the dog made one last desperate attempt to flee, but it had nowhere to hide. It was cornered, the stones still coming at it from all sides. The group's laughter echoed down the street, but this time it was tinged with a sense of discomfort. One of the tourists, a woman in her late 20s, began to feel uneasy. She had always loved animals and never understood why people found amusement in hurting them. She stepped forward and called out to the others, asking them to stop. "This isn't funny," she said, her voice tinged with concern. But her words were drowned out by the laughter of the group, who continued their thoughtless actions. Meanwhile, the dog, though frightened, tried to maintain its dignity. It was clear to anyone who had been paying attention that this was no ordinary stray. There was a calmness in its retreat, a kind of quiet strength that suggested it had been through worse and survived. The dog wasn't just reacting out of fear, it was also trying to make sense of the situation, trying to figure out if it could escape this torment. But the barrage of rocks continued, and with each passing moment, the situation became more tragic. Just when it seemed the dog might have had enough, a sudden change in the atmosphere occurred. The sound of laughter and the clattering of rocks was interrupted by a stern voice calling out from behind the group. "What do you think you're doing?" The tourists froze and turned around, suddenly aware that someone was watching. The voice belonged to an elderly man, walking slowly down the street toward them. His face was calm but had an undeniable air of authority. He didn't look like someone you would want to cross. The tourists, surprised by the man's sudden appearance, stepped back, momentarily taken aback by his presence. He wasn't like any other bystander. There was something about him, something that commanded respect. His clothes were simple, but there was an air of quiet dignity about him, and his steps were deliberate, each one weighted with purpose. The group fell silent as he made his way toward the dog, who had finally stopped running, its body trembling from the stress of the encounter. "What have you done?" the elderly man asked, his voice no longer a question, but a demand for an explanation. The tourists, unsure of how to respond, looked at each other nervously. The young man who had started the whole thing shrugged sheepishly. "We were just playing around," he said, trying to brush it off as a harmless prank. "It's just a stray dog, nothing serious." The elderly man's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the dog, who was now standing a few feet away, its eyes wide and fearful. The man's gaze softened for a moment, and he took a deep breath before speaking again. "You think it's just a stray dog? That dog means more than you'll ever understand." His voice was steady, but there was an intensity to his words that made the tourists pause. They hadn't anticipated a response like this. The woman who had initially spoken up moved a little closer, sensing that there was more to the situation than they had realized. "It's not just a stray," the man continued, his voice still calm but firm. "That dog belongs to someone. A man who served this country for many years. A man who fought on the front lines and came home with more than just physical scars." The tourists exchanged confused looks. They hadn't expected this turn in the conversation. "Who are you?" one of them finally asked. "What's your connection to the dog?" The man's eyes remained fixed on them, unblinking. "I'm the one who takes care of him now," the man said simply. "And I'm the one who knows the true worth of this dog. You see, that dog is not just a stray. It's the companion of a retired Army general, someone who dedicated his life to this country. It's a companion that has seen things most people could never imagine, and it has lived through more than any of you could ever understand. And yet, despite everything it's been through, it remains loyal. It remains kind." The tourists stood frozen, their guilt beginning to sink in as they realized the gravity of the situation. The dog wasn't some nameless, faceless street animal. It was the cherished companion of a man who had served with honor and sacrifice. They had just violated the trust and respect that should have been given to such a bond. They hadn't known it at the time, but now as they looked at the dog, they understood. They had hurt something that was more than just an animal. They had hurt a symbol of loyalty and service. The elderly man didn't raise his voice, but his words carried a weight that the tourists couldn't ignore. "Next time, think before you act. You never know who you're hurting or what you might be disrespecting." He turned away from the group and called the dog over to him with a soft whistle. The dog hesitated for a moment, still cautious, but recognizing the familiar voice. Slowly, it walked back to the man's side, its steps tentative but steady. The group of tourists stood in stunned silence as the elderly man led the dog away, his every movement calm and deliberate. There were no more words exchanged, only the lingering sense of regret that filled the air. They had come to the town for an adventure, but what they had gotten was a lesson in empathy, in respect, and in the consequences of thoughtless actions. As they watched the man and the dog walk away, one of the tourists turned to the others, her face pale with embarrassment. "We really messed up," she said quietly. "I didn't realize what we were doing." The others nodded in agreement, a heavy silence falling over the group. They had set out to have fun, but now they realized that in their pursuit of amusement, they had forgotten the most important lesson of all: the importance of treating others, human or animal, and with dignity and respect. The tourists stood there in stunned silence as the elderly man, with a deliberate calmness, led the stray dog away from the group. The laughter and excitement of the moment had evaporated, replaced by an uneasy quiet. It was as if the entire atmosphere had shifted, leaving behind a deep sense of discomfort. They had come here to explore, to enjoy a break from their everyday lives. But this was something they had never expected, a reality far more serious than they had imagined. For a few moments they just stood there, unsure of how to respond or what to do next. The woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had tried to stop the cruelty, was the first to speak. "I don't think we fully understood what we were doing," she said, her voice softer now, filled with the weight of guilt. The other tourists nodded, the embarrassment of the situation settling in. They hadn't set out to harm the dog. In fact, when they first began throwing the rocks, it had seemed like nothing more than a bit of harmless fun. But the laughter had faded quickly, and the consequences of their actions had become glaringly obvious. The elderly man had said so little, yet his words carried a power that the tourists could not ignore. He hadn't scolded them, hadn't raised his voice in anger. Instead, he had simply spoken the truth, a truth they were now beginning to grasp. The dog was not just some nameless, discarded animal wandering the streets. It was the companion of someone who had given years of service to this country. It was the loyal companion of a retired Army general, a man who had fought on the front lines, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others. And they had treated it like a nuisance, like an object to be ridiculed. As the tourists turned to leave, they felt a strange sense of unease lingering in the air. The excitement of their trip had been tainted, and it wasn't just the dog they had harmed. It was the realization that, for a moment, they had lost sight of the very thing they had come to experience, the beauty of human connection, the importance of respect for life, and the understanding that every living creature, no matter its status or circumstance, deserved dignity. They had assumed too much, judged too quickly. They had looked at the dog and seen only a stray, a street animal, nothing more. But what they didn't know, what they hadn't taken the time to consider, was that this dog was not just a stray. It had a history. It had a purpose. It had been loved and cared for by someone who understood the importance of loyalty, sacrifice, and companionship. The elderly man had shared only a small fraction of that history, but it was enough to make them realize how deeply they had underestimated the situation. Later that evening, as the group returned to their hotel, the mood had shifted. The laughter had faded, replaced by quiet reflection. They couldn't stop thinking about the dog and the elderly man. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had done something wrong, something that went beyond just a prank. They had disrespected the dog, yes, but more than that, they had disrespected the memory of the retired general. They had failed to understand that every being has a story, a history, and a purpose, and that story was not theirs to mock or diminish. In the hours that followed, the group couldn't shake the image of the elderly man walking away with the dog at his side. The calm authority in his steps had been unmistakable, a quiet reminder that some things in life are bigger than us, that there are forces at play that we may never fully understand. And in that moment, the tourist had felt small. They had felt insignificant in the face of something so much larger than their initial sense of amusement. The next morning, the group was still grappling with the events of the day before. They hadn't discussed it much, but the air between them had shifted. It was clear that something had changed. The woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had tried to stop the rock throwing, was the first to bring it up again. She was sitting at the breakfast table, her eyes distant as she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "I think we need to go back," she said quietly. "We need to apologize." The group looked at her, some surprised, others nodding in agreement. It wasn't something any of them had considered in the immediate aftermath, but now, as they reflected on what had happened, the idea of leaving things unresolved felt wrong. They couldn't just carry on with their trip as if nothing had happened. They couldn't just forget the lesson that had been handed to them so abruptly. "I agree," another tourist spoke up. "We need to make things right. I don't know if we can, but at least we can try." The others nodded in agreement, each of them coming to terms with the weight of their actions in their own way. There was a collective understanding now, a shared recognition that what they had done had been wrong. And more importantly, they understood that the apology wasn't just for the dog. It was for the elderly man, the retired general, and everyone who had been affected by their thoughtless behavior. They made their way to the beachside house later that morning. The sun was shining brightly, casting a warm glow on the street as they walked toward the small, quiet home where the general had lived. The house was modest, not grand or imposing, but there was an air of dignity about it. The tourists paused outside the gate, hesitating for a moment. None of them had met the general, and yet they all felt a certain reverence for the man whose life they had unknowingly disrespected. It felt as though they were standing in the presence of something sacred, something that demanded respect. The elderly man was outside tending to the garden. When he saw the group approaching, he didn't seem surprised. He simply stopped what he was doing and looked at them with the same quiet authority he had shown the day before. "We've come to apologize," the woman said, stepping forward. "We were wrong. We didn't understand what we were doing, and we're really sorry." The elderly man nodded, but he didn't say anything right away. He simply watched them, his expression unreadable. The tourist stood there, waiting for some kind of reaction. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man spoke. "I didn't expect an apology," he said, his voice calm but carrying a note of understanding. "But I'm glad you came." He looked down at the dog, who was resting peacefully in the yard. "The dog didn't deserve your cruelty. But I believe people can change, and that's why I didn't raise my voice yesterday. I wanted you to see the bigger picture, to understand what this dog means to me and what it means to others." The tourist felt a wave of guilt wash over them again. They had expected the man to be angry, to yell at them for their thoughtless actions. But instead, he had shown them something far more powerful: forgiveness and the opportunity to learn and grow. "We understand now," another tourist spoke up, his voice filled with sincerity. "And we won't forget this lesson. Not ever." The elderly man nodded again, his eyes softening. "I'm glad to hear that," he said simply. "Sometimes it takes an experience like this to help people see what's really important in life. It's not about what you can take, but what you can give. It's about understanding the value of loyalty, respect, and the bond that ties us all together." With that, the group offered their apologies once more, each of them expressing their regret in their own way. The man accepted their words, but there was no need for grand gestures or proclamations. The lesson had already been learned. What mattered now was how they would move forward from this moment, how they would change their behavior, and how they would carry this newfound understanding with them. As the group left the house, their steps were lighter. They felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace that had eluded them the day before. The incident had shaken them, yes, but it had also opened their eyes. They had learned something invaluable about respect, about the power of empathy, and about how small actions can have far-reaching consequences. And in the end, they realized that the dog wasn't the only one who had been given a chance for healing. So had they. The group made their way back to their hotel after their conversation with the elderly man, but the lesson they had learned was far from forgotten. It lingered with them as they went about the remainder of their trip, a quiet reminder of how fragile human connections can be and how important it is to treat all living beings with respect. The weight of their actions hung over them, but it wasn't just about guilt anymore. It was about understanding the gravity of what had occurred and how their perspectives had shifted. The next few days in the town felt different. What had once seemed like a simple vacation had turned into something more profound. Each of them found themselves reflecting on the way they had lived their lives up until that point and the way they had approached the world around them. They had come to this place expecting to be entertained, to find amusement, but instead they had been given something far more valuable, a reminder of the deeper meaning of respect, empathy, and kindness. Though the group didn't discuss it much with each other after the apology, the atmosphere had changed. There was a quiet sense of understanding between them now. A shared bond formed from the realization that they had acted without thought and that, in doing so, they had hurt something that was important: the general's dog. But more than that, they had hurt the general himself, whose life and service to the country had earned him the right to be respected. The dog was not just a stray. It was a living testament to the sacrifices made by a man who had served his country, a dog that had remained by his side through countless trials and struggles. As the days passed, the group found themselves seeking out more of the town's local culture, trying to make the most of the trip that had taken an unexpected turn. They visited museums, strolled through markets, and explored the natural beauty of the area. But the memory of the dog and the elderly man remained with them, coloring their experiences in ways they hadn't expected. The woman who had spoken up first, the one who had tried to stop the rock throwing, found herself thinking about the general's words long after they had parted ways. The elderly man had spoken so quietly but with such conviction. He had not raised his voice in anger or condemnation, but rather he had chosen to educate, to guide them to a place of understanding. His words had been a bridge, and it had been up to them to cross it. The woman couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for that, even though she knew they didn't deserve it. It was easy to dismiss the general's dog as just another stray in need of attention, but it wasn't. Not to the general. Not to anyone who had ever been touched by the bond between a man and his loyal companion. As she walked along the beach that afternoon, the wind gently rustling the leaves of nearby trees, she thought about the general's service to his country. It wasn't just about fighting in battles or winning wars. It was about the quiet strength that came from protecting others, from making sacrifices so that others could live in peace. She thought about how that strength had carried over into his bond with his dog, a bond formed not just from companionship, but from loyalty and love. In many ways, the dog had become a symbol of that strength, a living representation of everything the general had stood for. The others in the group were processing the event in their own ways. Some had already begun to talk about the lessons they had learned. One man in particular, the young tourist who had started the whole thing by throwing the first rock, seemed to have taken the most to heart. He had been visibly shaken by the elderly man's words and had been unusually quiet since the encounter. As he sat at the hotel bar later that evening, he opened up to the rest of the group. "I honestly didn't think it was a big deal," he said, staring down at his drink. "I didn't think about what that dog meant to someone. I didn't think about the bigger picture. I just thought it was a stupid stray dog, you know. But after hearing what the man said, I feel like an idiot. I didn't realize how much my actions could hurt someone, not just the dog but the person who cared for it. That dog wasn't just an animal to him. It was family." The others nodded, listening intently. It was clear that this moment had hit him hard and for good reason. He had been the one to initiate the rock throwing, and now, facing the consequences of his actions, he was grappling with his own sense of accountability. For the first time, he was seeing things through a different lens, understanding the impact his behavior could have on others, something he hadn't considered before. "I've been thinking about it all day," he continued. "I've been thinking about how we treat animals in general, and how we treat people. We just don't think about it. We go through life doing what's easy, doing what feels good in the moment, and we don't think about the consequences. But sometimes, those consequences are huge." The woman who had initially spoken up also shared her thoughts, speaking from her own perspective. "I was raised to respect animals, to see them as living beings with their own feelings and needs. But even I didn't fully understand what we were doing. I didn't realize the depth of it until the man said what he did. It's not just about being kind to animals. It's about being kind to the people they belong to, too. It's about seeing the bigger picture, and we just didn't." The group fell into a contemplative silence, each person reflecting on their own actions and the larger implications of their behavior. It was a sobering conversation, one that had nothing to do with their vacation plans. And yet, it was perhaps the most important discussion they had had since arriving in the town. It wasn't about the sightseeing or the souvenirs. It wasn't even about the dog itself. It was about what the dog represented and how their moment of thoughtlessness had disrupted that understanding. The next morning, the group woke up early, determined to make the most of the final day of their trip. They had already booked a tour of a local nature reserve, but for some reason, the excitement that had originally accompanied the thought of seeing more of the town was gone. Instead, they felt a sense of quiet purpose, as if they were continuing a journey of a different kind, one that wasn't just about exploring new places, but about exploring their own values and attitudes toward the world around them. As the tour guide led them through the reserve, pointing out various plants and animals, the group found their minds wandering back to the lessons they had learned. They weren't as engaged in the usual tourist activities as they had been at the start of the trip. The excitement of exploring new places had been replaced by a deeper sense of connection to the world they were in. Not just the people and animals around them, but also to the land itself. They had come to realize that true exploration wasn't about taking, but about giving, about respecting the world they were experiencing and leaving it better than they had found it. By the time the tour had ended, the group was noticeably quieter than they had been at the beginning of the trip. Their shared experiences had shifted their perspectives in ways they hadn't anticipated, and although they still had some time left in the town, they knew that the trip would never be the same. They had learned something invaluable. They had learned to pause, to reflect, and to consider the impact of their actions before proceeding. It wasn't just about being a good tourist, it was about being a good person, about treating all living beings with kindness and understanding. The woman who had spoken up earlier turned to the others as they gathered their things to leave. "I think I'm going to carry this lesson with me," she said softly. "I know I will. I think we all will. It's something that will stay with me for the rest of my life." The others nodded in agreement, each of them quietly processing what the trip had meant for them. As they left the nature reserve and headed back to the hotel to pack up, they realized that their time in the town had given them more than they could have ever hoped for. It had taught them that empathy and understanding were the true keys to connecting with others, that sometimes the most unexpected experiences could lead to the most profound lessons. When they said goodbye to the elderly man before leaving the town, there was no need for further words. They had already said what needed to be said, and the respect they had for him and for the dog was evident in their actions and the way they carried themselves. The lesson had been learned, and it was one they would carry with them long after their vacation was over. As they left the town behind, they knew that the true journey was not one that could be mapped on a map, but one that could only be measured by how they chose to live their lives moving forward. They had learned the importance of compassion, of empathy, and of respect. And in doing so, they had gained something far greater than any souvenir could offer. In the end, this story is not just about a stray dog or a retired general. It's about understanding, respect, and the connections that tie us all together, even when we least expect them. As you go about your day, take a moment to reflect on how you view the world and the people around you. What can you learn from the story of this dog and its loyal owner? If you enjoyed this story, remember to like and share this video, and consider subscribing for more thought-provoking content.